I'll wait another 30 seconds or so till we officially introduce the panel. Good to see everybody. Nice to see everyone. Hi, Susan Shevitz. Everybody, again, so nice to be with everybody, and I was so inspired by the first panel. Really good job, everybody. So our next panel is going to look at various aspects of early adult, emerging adult education and interactions in the Jewish community. I think that what's going to be so fascinating about this panel is that each of our presenters looked at a specific point in a young adult's life that gives us insights into many of the dilemmas that we face as Jewish educators, and they're each going to talk about a various area of dilemma or challenge or tension that we face in Jewish education. So with that said, that was really just a snippet, but I just want to say, I don't remember off the top of my head. I do now. David speaks about young college students. Talia speaks about high school students, older high school students, and Gita is going to look at couples going into marriage. So again, very specific moments in early adulthood. And I'm going to turn it over to David. Nice to see you in your tie this morning.
Yeah, I'm taking a page from Rabbi Michael Shire, who usually wears a tie. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully it will work. All right.
Everyone, I'm going to post, while David shares, I'm going to post a Google Doc. For those of you who are with us for the last session, I'm going to post a Google Doc with several prompts so that those listening can share their reflections and with each other and then with David after the fact. So please look for that in the chat.
Okay. Okay, can everyone see? Someone say they can see my PowerPoint here. Okay, I see thumbs up. Great. All right, so good. Jewish knowledge and Jewish engagement, examining the effectiveness of Jewish education in creating Jewishly engaged young adults. So really I was studying the connection between Jewish knowledge and Jewish engagement, but the subtitle is there, examining the effectiveness of Jewish education, because that's really the underlying question of this research and of so much research in Jewish education. And that underlying essential question is Jewish education effective? Does Jewish education work? So that is what is at stake here. All right. The question, so this is my research question. For undergraduates at a Boston University educated in a Reform Supplementary Religious School, how does Jewish knowledge correlate to Jewish engagement? And that's quite wordy. To be a little bit more informal, my question was, if you know more Jewish stuff, do you do more Jewish stuff? And of course, I'll tease that out, but that was my focus. Okay. So briefly about the literature. In general, researchers found that more Jewish education does tend to lead to greater Jewish engagement. There was also a finding in multiple researchers that Jewish home life potentiates Jewish education, meaning that the richer someone's Jewish home life, the greater the effect of Jewish education on their Jewish engagement. And this confused a lot of researchers, and it confused some of their findings, because sometimes when people are studying Jewish education and its effect, what they're really studying is the effect of Jewish home life. There was no research that addressed my specific topic, connecting amount of Jewish knowledge with Jewish engagement. So it was needed. And in all of this research, the dependent variable, the thing that Jewish education is hopefully affecting, it's always some formulation of Jewish engagement or Jewish identity or Jewish involvement. That's always kind of what's at stake. Okay. All right, the research. So what did I do? I studied 8 first and second year college students at a local university, and each student took my assessment of Jewish knowledge, and that assessment generated quantitative data, a score out of 50 possible points. And the topics, as you see, are quite broad and were based on scholars' understanding of the different domains of Jewish knowledge. Each student, each participant also went through a structured interview with me regarding their Jewish engagement in college. And I spent roughly an hour and a half with each student, so I got to know them pretty well. The personal stuff, I asked them questions about spirituality, I asked some questions about any kind of food practice, and I really tried to get it kind of like their internal Jewish engagement. And then interpersonal, I asked some questions like, do you have any Jewish friends? Do you ever talk about Jewish topics with those friends? And then the organizational, there's a typo there, sorry, so it'd be personal, interpersonal, and organizational. The organizational was things like, do you ever go to services at Hillel? And I just want to sort of emphasize here that I did not conceive of Jewish engagement as just going to synagogue, going to services. Of course, there's many ways to be engaged with Judaism. Some can be almost invisible, just people's thoughts and feelings. And so I tried to tease that out as well in the interviews. And that was qualitative data. So the research included both quantitative and qualitative data. So here's some quantitative data. There's a lovely graph you see. And you can see the dotted line shows that there was, in this small group, there was a clear correlation that more Jewish knowledge tended to accompany greater Jewish engagement, but not always. In some cases, Jewish engagement was possible without Jewish knowledge. There were 2 notable outliers, and of course these names are all changed, but there were 2 notable outliers. Michael, who had the lowest score on the knowledge assessment, but was deeply, powerfully engaged in Hillel and with the Jewish fraternity. And then Rachel, who had the 3rd lowest knowledge score, you could see she's also really an outlier. And she had a really potent personal Jewish engagement. Here's a quote from Rachel. She said, when I'm doing really well in life, I find myself thanking God or trying to pray in some way. Or if I'm doing relatively poorly, I'll try to reevaluate what I'm doing. And I'll be like, maybe this is God's way of telling me I should be doing things differently. So she was deeply spiritually engaged, and yet she had minimal Jewish knowledge. And I'll try to describe her a little bit later. Okay, so now the qualitative data was really where I found the most interesting and rich findings. So let's see, on the left side, Jewish knowledge led to personal Jewish engagement. So I actually found some causation here, places where Jewish knowledge directly led to, or at least supported and allowed, personal Jewish engagement. And here's a couple of examples. Evan, here's what Evan said. Friday after classes, I will usually take 15 minutes to detox from the week for Shabbat. It's one of the greatest things we do as Jews, is to take a break. Noah, he said that Israel's right to exist and its security and things like that are really important to me. And Jennifer said that it's nice to have more options when eating. I appreciate eating kosher. It's not like pork is going to make me sick, but there's a tradition behind that, so I try to follow it, but I still don't eat shellfish. And then John said, I wrap tefillin occasionally, and I have other prayer practices. I don't do the traditional davening regularly, but I do the prayer for wrapping and then a short period of meditation. So all 4 of those participants had among the highest Jewish knowledge scores. And what I found was that their Jewish knowledge allowed them to have, personally important, nuanced, informed opinions and practices, Jewish opinions and practices. In contrast, my experience with participants with lower knowledge scores, especially Michael and Sarah, was that they had trouble expressing personal Jewish engagement because it seemed to me they had no frame in which to express it. On the other side, low Jewish knowledge did not deter interpersonal or organizational engagement. Or in other words, the students with low knowledge, that did not stop them from engaging meaningfully with Jewish organizations and with other Jewish people. So Sarah, for example, 2 of her 5 roommates were Jewish, and she explained that we did an Easter Passover type situation, and they hid Easter eggs, and I hid an afikomen, and it was fun. Before I did Passover with my roommates, I should figure out what Passover is, I thought. Of course, I know what it is, but just to find a little more information. And then Michael, so all of these students, by the way, had low Jewish knowledge. Michael had the lowest Jewish knowledge, yet he attended all Shabbat dinners at Hillel and spent most of his time socializing in the Jewish fraternity. And then Aaron planned a large Rosh Hashanah dinner, among other organizational and communal involvement. She said about this dinner, "We had some Israeli boys and they did prayers for us. I cooked and organized it, but other people brought different things. It was just a really great experience." So for these students, lack of knowledge was not a deterrent to their interpersonal or organizational engagement. Okay. All right, so what does it all mean?
David, you have 1 minute, okay?
Okay, great. All right, so what does it mean? We must teach for knowledge to create Jews with a personal connection to Judaism. So I found that in order for these students to have a meaningful, personal, internal Jewish connection, they needed to know things. And so if we want our students to have that connection, we need to make sure that they know things. I drew some conclusions here that someone who is personally engaged is more likely to build a Jewish home. So, a Jewish person might, who's organizationally engaged, might attend Kol Nidre each year. But for that person to want to build a Jewish home, I think there's something internal that needs to be there, something personal. And the same thing for Jewish leaders. I think that they need something internal to rely on. In terms of the other side of the data here, I found that Jewish communities and colleges work, right? So those without knowledge, who with less confidence for that reason, were able to engage because they were relying on the community, the leaders, and other students. And so, the Hillel at this university, it was clear to me that it was a really accepting, welcoming space, and students felt very able to just walk in. And so, based on this information, I think that we need more places like that in the adult world, more broadly accepting, non-denominational Jewish institutions. And the last thing I'll say, just as last bullet, and I haven't discussed this yet, but like across the board, the students reported that they were not interested in religious Judaism. They were interested in interpersonal and communal and cultural Judaism. And they made fun of themselves and said things like, it's a very millennial thing. And of course, that may change as they get older, but based on this data set, we need to make sure that our institutions are offering lots and lots of more, in fact, interpersonal, non-ritual programming.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you very, very much. Wonderful presentation. Welcome again for anyone who just joined us. I want to make sure that everyone knows that we'll let the 3 presenters present, and then we'll have time for questions to all 3 afterwards. So hold your questions. You can begin to put them in the chat if you want. Obviously, the feedback forms for each individual presenter will be going to the individual presenters. So with that said, it's my pleasure to now introduce Gita.
Thank you. Okay, let's try to share my screen.
And thanks to everyone for adding comments for David. Please feel free to add any final comments, and I'm putting Gita's reflection form into the chat right now.
Can you see my screen? Great. Okay. Before I start, hi, it's really nice to see everyone. I want to give a big thank you to Susan Shevitz, my advisor, for walking me through every step of this process, and also to Deb, who I would not have been able to do this without. So thank you to both of them. And just for the purpose of this panel, I just want to say, while many of my respondents were young adults, my survey is actually looking at anyone who got married between 2016 and 2020. So many are young adults and many are just adults. So that's just a disclaimer. So the central question of my thesis is what takes place in the meetings that clergy have with couples prior to their wedding. And the reason this was interesting to me from a personal standpoint is, as someone becoming a rabbi and beginning to officiate at weddings, I was noticing how hard it is to figure out how to spend 3 or 4 precious meetings with a couple. And there's so much educational content that one could cover, from learning about the rituals of a Jewish wedding ceremony, to learning about what it is to build a Jewish home in general, to Intro to Judaism 101. And then there's the whole couples counseling, pastoral care. What does this life transition mean to a couple? So I was curious how this looked out in the field. And just to give context, if you all take a minute to think, when is the last time you got to have one-on-one meetings with a rabbi in 4 consecutive sessions? It's a rare thing to get to do. So how are we using that time in the most optimal way? So I looked at expectations that couples had, how they spent their time in these meetings, and then what the outcomes were of these meetings. And I found that 75% of couples said that actually what they wanted to do in their time with the rabbi was prepare for the ceremony itself. Then couples also talked about these other elements of pastoral care and premarital counseling. And something that's interesting to note in the research is that of couples in America that receive any type of premarital education, 90% of them are doing it in a religious context. So if couples are getting any education before their weddings, it is happening with clergy. And so what are Jewish clergy doing? Research also shows that the vast majority of clergy in America graduate seminary feeling underprepared and not competent in premarital education. So we have Jewish educators preparing couples for marriage who may not feel totally equipped to do that. And so my research really looked at, how do rabbis choose to spend this time? Is it wedding planning? Is it more planning for a marriage? And what does that even look like? Is it relationship work, or is it Jewish education more broadly? So I surveyed 91 couples with a Google survey, and here are going to be some of the results. And you can see in this quote about expectations, couples kind of want everything out of these meetings. I want to plan my ceremony, discuss the rituals, be on the same page as family members, do premarital counseling. That's a lot to have in 4 sessions. So something that I found is that of the content covered in these meetings, usually the ceremony logistics were at the front and center, and topics such as sex, intimacy, finances, money, relationship skills were covered at the best, like a little bit, but usually not at all. And that's interesting because statistics that talk about divorce also talk about these issues being ones that couples struggle with throughout their marriage. So perhaps rabbis are not seeing their premarital meetings with couples as trying to prepare for a healthy relationship, and see it more as planning for a wedding ceremony itself. Something else that I found was interesting is that only 11% of couples said that rabbis required them to do any outside work from these meetings. So even if rabbis didn't feel comfortable to approach these topics with couples, they also were not requiring couples to go do this work elsewhere. So then I also asked what the couples appreciated most to see how that mapped onto what their expectations were. And while the vast majority expected to talk about the ceremony logistics, the vast majority of couples really appreciated the pastoral care that the rabbis brought to these meetings. And when I talk about pastoral care, I really mean discussions that the rabbi is opening up to have of a more spiritual nature, discussing values, meaning personal growth of the couple. As you can see in this quote at the bottom of the page, a lot of couples really appreciated that most. So what I really want to spend my time today, the remaining 5 minutes, is talking about the conclusions and suggestions for the field about how we can think about these meetings as wedding planning or really more about marriage planning. So the first thing I think is just to make that distinction feels like a big deal. As this person said, meeting with our rabbi influenced us how to think about our wedding, not as a one-day event, but a true commitment to a Jewish life together forever. How can rabbis see this as their role and not just being a glorified wedding planner? And this might seem obvious, but it really isn't, for as most couples stated when they went into these meetings. There should be a greater emphasis on pastoral care and rabbis acknowledging that this is their specialty. This is something they've been trained in doing, how to be listeners, how to ask open-ended questions, not to use the time planning logistics as much as possible, and being really transparent with couples about this from the start. And another way that rabbis can do this is they can get trained in couples assessments. They don't need to be a certified marriage counselor to be able to have these conversations. They can actually take trainings that provide them insight into how to give couples an assessment and then how to interpret that assessment with the couple to identify where they may need more help. And certain seminaries offer this class as an elective to students, but not all do. Then there are alternative models that we could look at. So here in Boston, we have Beyond the Chuppah at Maim Chaim, which basically takes this responsibility away from the rabbi and makes sure that couples will have several sessions with a trained educator to talk about these issues that go beyond the wedding itself. Something for rabbis in synagogues to think about is what would it look like to have a more formal partnership with classes such as these so that couples don't have to take on the extra expense themselves or don't have to go out of their way to sign up, but it would be a natural part of working with the rabbi that they already signed up for. Another model is for clergy, instead of doing one-on-one meetings in such great depth with each and every couple, is to offer classes or retreats on an annual basis for all couples that they are officiating their weddings that year. So one person said, we covered many of the topics about conflict resolution, money, intimacy, not in our meetings with the rabbi, but in a weekend retreat that the same rabbi offered for engaged couples. So rabbis thinking more holistically about how to create community between all the couples they're working with at a time. And then one model that I think deserves a lot more attention and is actually much more common in the Orthodox world than in the liberal Jewish world is actually to have two separate professionals that a couple works with. The rabbi who's officiating their wedding, they can talk about the rituals of a Jewish wedding ceremony. They can talk a little bit about their relationship, but focus on the day itself, and actually work with a totally separate rabbi, because the person that they want to speak under their chuppah about them with their family and friends may be a totally different person than with whom they want to talk about finances and sex and topics of a more personal nature. And maybe that should be someone that really plays the role of couples counselor, whether that's a rabbi or a trained therapist. And for rabbis really to encourage or even require couples to take that on. So my research only really hit the tip of the iceberg. And so suggestions for further study around this topic, I think, would be to do a similar survey with a population that had much less of a Jewish background than the people I surveyed, because I think for many couples, this is an opportunity actually for more basic Judaism 101 and what does that look like. I think a survey of clergy to understand from their perspective what education goes on in these meetings, because my survey looked at what the couples perceive to be happening in these meetings. I also would love to look more at rabbinic education and training for premarital education and how our seminaries are training rabbis and cantors and clergy members to feel confident to take on this role in a serious way. And in a dream world, we would do a survey of couples throughout the process. An entry survey as before they begin meeting with the rabbi, exit interviews as they come out of this process, to really get at what is going on in terms of education in these meetings and this special time. So thank you.
Wow, Gita, amazing. Wait, just want to turn off the timer. You finished with a minute left. Very interesting topic, really provocative in terms of us as educators and potential clergy and potential educators. And really, you did a nice job of the breadth of the topic as well. So really beautiful. last but not least will be Talia, who's going to look at the issues in high school with high school students. So we'll give Talia a minute to Gita to unshare her screen and Talia to, there's that green thing, you have to unshare, Gita.
I know, sorry everyone, 1 second.
Okay. Yep, stop sharing.
In the meantime, I'm gonna put up Talia's Google Doc so people can contribute their reflections.
Right. And I see already there was one question came in for Gita, so I'll just say it out loud so Gita can maybe think about it while we're transitioning. Talia asked, she's curious if you had the opportunity to change your approach to premarital counseling based on the research, or if you've thought about how it might. So just something to put in the hopper there.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Nice to see everyone here. Nice to be here. Thank you. For some reason, my computer's not letting me go into present mode, but maybe if I present and then share. But I'll echo Gita's thank yous. I want to thank Deb Skolnick-Einhorn for her help with this, and my advisor, Rabbi Jane Kanarak, with whom their support, I would not have been able to get this done. So I really, really appreciate that. Okay, it looks like it's working now, maybe. Can everyone see it? Are we good? Great. So I looked at the use of halachic language in a classroom at a pluralistic Jewish high school. So I'm interested in this topic. I went to Jewish school from kindergarten through 12th grade. My first K through 6 at a Salman Schechter school, but then 7th through 12th at a pluralistic Jewish community school in the Northeast. And when I entered rabbinical school, I didn't go right from high school into rabbinical school, obviously, but when I entered into rabbinical school, I felt kind of that my text skills were pretty ill-prepared. I felt that having gone through 13 years of Jewish education, I really should feel more comfortable navigating Jewish texts and knowing, a page of Talmud and knowing the halachic discourse that's out there more than I did, whether I knew all the text, but I really felt ill-prepared. And then I entered Hebrew college, and I immediately saw the way that Hebrew college was teaching text in a pluralistic setting, and specifically halacha. And I was like, wait, I recognize Hebrew college is a place where everyone's buying into it. It's a rabbinical school, not a high school. But I said, wait, if Hebrew college is teaching halacha in a pluralistic setting, our Jewish community, this is a real opportunity here. I felt like my understanding of halacha, both the Hebrew text of it, but also the learning it in a pluralistic setting and understanding it with the knowledge of different denominations, different interpretations, sort of seeing myself as part of the conversation, was really important, and potentially didn't have to wait till rabbinical school to happen. So I decided that I wanted to go back to high school and look in to see what was happening. I graduated high school a long time ago. And I really had to narrow the question down. Sorry, my computer is being funny. So I really had to narrow the question down because I really just wanted to see how Jewish high schools, pluralistic Jewish high schools, were engaging with halacha, but that would have been a multi-year project. So with Jane and Deb's help, I narrowed down the question really to seeing what language are teachers using when they're teaching about halacha or mitzvot or Jewish practice or Jewish values in their classroom. So my project really focused on the use of language. And I conducted a qualitative study exploring that language at one pluralistic high school in the Northeast. And I observed 4 different 9th grade classrooms during their Jewish food unit. And I also interviewed the teachers of these classes and also the head of the Jewish Studies department. And I used audio recordings and field notes to collect the data, and obviously quoted teachers and students anonymously. So just want to make sure, the 9th grade is divided into 4 different classrooms. So there are 4 different classes, the Jewish Studies is. There's a Beit Midrash section, and that was taught by an Orthodox rabbi and was composed of students having mostly attended Jewish day school for elementary and middle school. so students coming with some kind of formal Jewish education. Then there was 2 non-Beit Midrash, what I call intermediate sections, and that was taught by a female Jewish educator who identified as modern Orthodox, and it had some students coming from day schools, but also some students maybe who came from traditional Jewish homes where they might be observing halakha, but not necessarily having formal education. So kind of a varied, but they had some familiarity with language and practice. And then what I call the non-Beit Midrash beginner section was taught by a rabbi who identifies as non-denominational, but traditional. And that was composed of many students primarily coming from public schools who really had not had much in the way of formal Jewish education at all. So that was the primary difference. And when I interviewed the teachers, they told me the primary difference between the Beit Midrash section and the non-Beit Midrash section was the use of Hebrew. And that was basically it, the use of Hebrew in their text. So through my observations and interviews, thank you. It became clear that depending on the course level and the background of the students in class, as well as the teacher's approach, it would have been great if I could have had the same teacher in all 3, but the use of halachic language varied throughout. Even though the 9th grade curriculum itself was very, very similar. So the assumption of knowledge and the knowledge of the student, I observed was the biggest factor in the difference. And then the other thing I'll say is thinking about what halakha is. There's really 2 different approaches I took in this project. One is halakha as the codes of Jewish law. So that might be a code of law like the Shulchan Aruch, like the Mishnah Torah, but specifically text of Jewish law. And the other is halakha, really, this is my best sort of interpretation of it, but halakha is an evolving tradition, interpreting texts and using other texts and interpretations and one's own knowledge and experience. So really kind of a way of life and an interpretive tradition. So that's the way I kind of look at halakha in this paper. So I'm gonna point out three specific areas of difference in the 3 sections. So the first is the use of halachic language itself. So in the Beit Midrash class, specifically halachic language was used when discussing kashrut, used when discussing texts from the Shulchan Aruch itself. So again, the codes of law. They looked at Orthodox Teshuvot by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And there was commonly halachic terms, like I gave the example of psak, so a ruling. He commonly used language like that in his class. And just something to note that when we talked about animal welfare, he actually did not use halachic language when talking about animal welfare. In the non-Beit Midrash intermediate class, so kashrut was framed using language of halakha. Kashrut was also framed using language of values and mitzvot and practices. Oops, I have a typo there. She kind of interspersed that language throughout, thanks. But other topics like Sa'ar Ba'alei Chaim and Ba'al Tashchit, and vegetarianism, were often framed using language of Jewish values and mitzvot. And I actually asked her about this in her interview, and she said, kashrut feels like there's a practical do's and don'ts, and the other topics feel harder to articulate a practical obligation. So I thought that was really interesting to note. And in the non-Beit Midrash beginner class, the word halakha was never used at all. I found that so fascinating. He did not once use the word halakha, and all of these categories were described as Jewish values or Jewish practice or mitzvot, and all of them were framed using a similar lens, and never was the word halakha mentioned. However, I'll say that in a second. So again, then we're looking at the texts used, the texts the students looked at. So in the Beit Midrash class, they looked at passages from the Torah. I mentioned before passages from the Shulchan Aruch itself, the Hebrew. And then they also looked at an article written on a tshuva by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. In the non-Beit Midrash classes, they used the identical curriculum and packets, they looked at passages from the Torah, and then they were giving source packets with both articles and some text interspersed throughout. So there was a text from the Mishnah Torah, but it wasn't necessarily framed as being a halachic text. And then finally, the role of discussion and conversation was really interesting in all three of these classes. So I found that in the Beit Midrash class, discussion was much more limited. Much of the bigger picture discussions were done through journal entries and not necessarily in class. And part of this, I think, was time. The students, again, were translating Hebrew text, and a lot of it was spent going over that and developing those skills. In the intermediate non-Beit Midrash class, discussion was an essential part of the class. And I quote this debate Midrash, the students participated in sort of their own halachic debate and gave their own voice. Thank you. And similarly, in the beginner non-Beit Midrash class, the discussion was the main focus of the class. Whether it was debate Midrash or asking questions or looking at different theologies, the students were always encouraged to share their opinions. And I'll just say my conclusion. So I mentioned, I'm not sure if I mentioned, the teachers all told me they did not teach halacha. So one of the things that I took away from this was that it's actually really important that halacha was coming up in these classes. And it's really important that the teachers are actually explicit about that, because there's an opportunity here. And finally, I'll just say, in all four of the ninth grade classes, the students took away many of the same themes and concepts. The significant difference was around skill building and the skills that the Beit Midrash class was developing versus the non-Beit Midrash class. And I'll just say I really believe that there's potential to have these students see themselves and their learning as continuing this interpretive tradition. But this project felt very narrow and is the first step in a much bigger conversation around how Jewish pluralistic high schools are engaging with halacha. Thank you.
Fantastic. Yes. Mazel tov, wonderful, Yasher Kochem to all three presenters, to David, to Talia, and to Gita. Beautiful presentations. What I'd like to do is just sort of situate our conversation right now around the instructional triangle, which hopefully all of our MJ Ed students are familiar with, the teacher, the student, and the subject matter or the content. I think that each of these presentations sort of put to the forefront the tension that sometimes can exist between the three poles or the 3 points of the triangle. So we'll open it up for questions. Deb, what do we have, about 5 minutes for questions? Is Deb still on, or Michael, 5 minutes for questions? 5 minutes? Okay. 7 minutes.
We have a few, yeah, we have 7 or 8. Sorry, I was
okay. So I'll put the timer on. So collect your thoughts and feel free to ask a question to all three panelists or to anyone individual if you have a probing or deepening question to any of the individual panelists. Where's David? How long of a pause should we give for the, is David still on?
I'm
here as long as they need.
What?
As long as they
need. As long as they need.
Okay.
Becca Weintraub, did you have something, or is that just a?
Yeah, I have to think about how to formulate it into a question, but I am curious about what I think is really interesting about the panel is that it feels like these are actually the different stages of following young folks, which people are touching on, which is just fascinating. So Talia is starting in high school, and I know the topics are slightly different, but starting in high school, moving into a young adult college age with David, and then moving into the marriage phases and like young adulthood and starting a family and the connection to Judaism. I'm wondering if the panelists want to speak a little bit about, or if you're seeing connections from your research to some of the research that you were hearing about, the limited research you're hearing about from the other panelists, and if that is influencing or has kind of shown, is adding or illuminating other parts of your work that you hadn't thought about before.
Yeah,
Sorry, Talia, go ahead.
So one of my places for further research is also, I didn't interview students, and it'd be also fascinating. I did see some research done interviewing alumni of Jewish day schools to see where they are. And I think that fits into more what David was talking about. But Becca, I had this exact same thought that I would be fascinated to follow them along and see what their engagement with Jewish life is, with halakha is, with, I think, connections with rabbis, and what planning sort of a meaningful ritual like a wedding would look like. So I think I think I have the same question, and it's such a narrow scope, so it's really interesting.
So a connection that I'm thinking about also, David talked about education and outcomes, and like how someone's education influences their practice. And something I was so interested in is, it seems that most couples, when they work with a clergy for their wedding, do not identify outcomes before they choose an officiant. Like, they're not saying, I want to use this time to learn more Jewish language, or I want to work on X issue in our relationship, or I want to talk about, they choose the officiant, and then after they kind of figure out what can that officiant offer them. And I'm curious if we could flip the model and say, how can clergy members be more transparent about their offerings and encourage couples to say, before you ask me to do your wedding, what do you want to get out of this process, and how can I help direct you to the right professional to get to that outcome?
Yeah, I think, Becca, did you ask about like my professional life and how this might affect it? I think you said that. Yeah, I mean, it was like across the board, the students all said, I really want to meet Jewish people and be in Jewish spaces and do Jewish things, and I don't want to pray, and I don't want to do ritual stuff. Like, and Hillel professionals, some of you are nodding your head, like that's apparently a common thing for like freshmen and sophomores. And then by the end of college, they often, I'm told, are looking for Jewish ritual. But I mean, for my part, like it was so overwhelming that this part of what they were saying, that in my work, I want to make sure that my synagogue is offering sort of low stakes, interpersonal, non-ritual programming, in a Jewish space with Jewish people, but not necessarily anything that is ritual.
I say one more thing to that point. Oh.
Okay, go ahead, Gita. Say one thing, and then we'll have Susan's question.
Just based on what David does, that I think with young adults in general, we always assume that they want lower stakes, lower requirements, lower barrier to entry. And I actually think, and what I found in my data, I actually think people want educators to raise the bar so that they can meet those requirements and actually get more out of their education. But if we just meet them where they're at in terms of, oh, we want them to just come in and make it as comfortable as possible, I don't know if they're always learning as much as they possibly could.
I echo that sentiment.
Right, this is clearly the crux of the discussion, of the tension between meeting students where they're at, the needs and the wants of the students, the needs and the wants of the subject matter, and the needs and the wants of the teachers and the community. Susan, and then I'll get to Devorah.
First of all, I really appreciate each of the three presentations. I have a lot of questions for everyone, but I'm going to ask just one general question, and then I may reach out to individuals to get more information about what you did. I'm always curious with any research about what you think the limitations of your data are and the limitations of the research and the interpretations, because you, in some cases, because the projects you were doing had to be contained. This wasn't a doctoral thesis or book project or something. So it's important to think about what you can infer and what you can't infer. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that a bit.
Great question. Anyone ready? And I actually would open that to all of our master's students who each had to have limited processes and limited data sets to work with. But if Talia, you laughing or
I'm laughing because one of the things Jane talked me through was when I had to narrow my focus, my question was then, why does this matter? So I really struggled with that question. And I think what we talked about was, this really is first step. It's important to get this understanding and recognize it as a building block to a bigger project, honestly, and one that certainly educators are working on around Talmud education right now, and hopefully soon around other Jewish education as well. But it's hard. I wanted to go way beyond the nano question.
Yeah. For my part, I mean, I talked to 8 students, so obviously I can't speak for, and someone posted this in the reflection, and they're right, I can't speak for anyone beyond those 8 students. I mean, like, the value in what I did, at least in my experience, was that I really got to know these 8 people, and like, there was striking similarity in each story, in each person's life, and in the things they said, and so I thought that was telling.
Okay, great, thank you, David. I'm going to hold at this point, since the 7 minutes are up. What I'd like to have happen was what Deb facilitated between our first 2 panels. So Devorah, if you want to put your question in the chat, and if the 3 panelists want to stay on, and people that have more questions want to stay on, we have how much, 15 minutes between the 2 panels? So I'm happy to stay here live and facilitate whatever questions and conversation we want to still have. So Devorah, please feel free to, why don't you can physically ask the question, you don't have to type it. Unmute though, yeah.
Thank you. I was particularly struck in the 3 presentations on the difference that I saw between the development of knowledge, that is connection, meaning, values kind of thing, and the development of skill, children and egg shakers, and the development of skills, whether they're text-based, scholastic, or otherwise. And I am curious about kind of the balance of those 2 things, and how we, Talia, you alluded to this a little bit in terms of the way educators are talking about Talmud classes at high school levels these days. But I'm particularly struck by how we balance those 2 components and raise them up for everyone, so that we can say, David, as you were talking about, like, yes, it's about connection and meaning and being surrounded by Jewish community and feeling good about being Jewish, but it's also about kind of slowly lifting up the knowledge skills so that the accessibility is there. Talia, as you were saying, when you walk into a different setting and you go, oh my God, I thought I knew, but now what have I been experiencing? So I don't know if there's a specific question, but I'm curious to kind of think further about, at these different stages and also at other pieces, how we balance those 2 kind of elements of teaching and learning.
Great, Devorah, thank you. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. That was kind of the most interesting thing that I found, was that for people to engage with community, they didn't need a whole lot. And I think that, like, and what I discovered was that like, community works. And, like, yeah, obviously community works, but, like, no, I talked to people and it became clear that it works. But then the other thing I found was that for someone to have something that's like they own, their own Judaism, like, it has to do with identity and self-conception and things that I wrote pages and pages about. I found that to have that, you do need, you said skills. I think skills is a thing that's obviously very close to knowledge. You need skills. You need to know things. You need to know some Jewish practice. And I won't get into details, but yeah.
Great. Gita, Talia, you want to comment on that? Susie. Oh, unmute. Unmute. I can't hear you.
I think she has something for after.
I'd like to hear if they have comments first, and then I want to pose another question. Thank you.
Okay, fine. So Gita, Talia.
I'll just say on this question of, like, skills and how to balance, I think at least when couples are working with a rabbi or cantor or clergy member one-on-one for a wedding, maybe skills is not actually what they should be focusing on. Maybe the relationship that is built there is gonna, like, the benefits in the long run will be far greater if they spend that time really investing in building strong relationships. And maybe the content knowledge that often happens in those spaces could actually happen in a bigger class type setting. And that one-on-one time, I think, is really special. And so we should think about the best use of that time, which may be more relational than content.
Talia?
Yeah, and I think I'll just add, I mean, I share, like, it's a clear tension. In all the literature, that tension was there. In my observations, it was there. And I think time, you know, when you're looking at like a high school, they're also balancing Jewish studies and secular studies. And so time, and these kids, you know, extracurricular, like there's not a lot of time. Time, like, is a limited resource. So I think that, but I think I would actually agree with Gita's approach. It may be a different approach, but I think a reframe could be helpful in thinking about, actually, let's think about how to develop these skills in a different kind of way, you know, thinking, you know, putting the students at the like forefront of the conversation and how they can build certain skills that way, as opposed to necessarily translating Hebrew texts or things like that, yeah, and also thinking about the informal Jewish education that happens in the institution as well. That's the other thing I'll add, so.
Thank you. A really great question. I just want to add one sentence and then we'll turn to Susie. When I was thinking about this challenge of the 3 papers, one of the things I was thinking about was sort of the tension or the dialectic between knowledge, behavior, and action. And I think that that's part of what we're touching on and dancing around at the edges here. That there, you know, so not to sort of bifurcate between affective and cognitive, but how much knowledge, behavior, and action need to interact with each other. And I think that's what all 3 of you are pushing on. Susie.
Great. I'll piggyback on what Marian just said and say that I'm looking at the opportunities that each of you raised for this particular stage in the life of the learner. And that's based on what they are capable of intellectually, whatever background they've come from. They've reached certain cognitive milestones, hopefully, and, you know, with some variation, what they're capable of or what they've achieved so far socially, emotionally, and looking at these as opportunities. So in David's case, we know how many students really connect with their Judaism only at the college level, for better or for worse. And how do we capitalize on that stage of life when people are seeking meaning and maybe thinking differently about their lives, beginning to imagine a future, which certainly connects to the time when a couple is engaged. And I know that my son and daughter-in-law had the most magnificent experience working with a family friend and Ari's former headmaster, Josh Elkin, in that process. And it was, I think, so much more than they ever even could have imagined it would be. Perhaps not knowing, Gita, what they hoped to get out of it at the outset, but because they, even if the fact that they had been together for 9 years previous to those meetings didn't mean they had figured everything out. And I think looking at the issues around the ceremony from the perspective of wanting it to best reflect who they were, their ketubah reflecting who they are as evolving Jewish human beings, and the kind of Beit Israel that they're imagining they want to create together was enriched by what they learned together with Josh, and he gave them lots of homework, and they appreciated the homework. They really appreciated the homework, and it all came to bear fruit in the actual Kiddushin under the chuppah, and beyond that, some of the topics that were raised. So I think understanding that for teens in this pluralistic Jewish school, whether they came with a rich text background or a deeper Hebrew knowledge background or not, here's this unique opportunity. And maybe they've never really discussed halakha. Maybe the teachers in their professional development never really thought about what it is that why they are doing what they're doing. What's the big picture, big idea that they hope to come across, however they're bringing it into practice in those different Beit Midrash settings. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Susie. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the advisors. We're really going to take a pause so everyone can take a stretch break and a bio break. And really, all 6 of the presentations have been so inspiring. Yasher koach to everybody. Good to see everyone. And now for a break.
Thank you, Marian.
Thank you.